you need the engineer there for a certain thing. You need the academic perspective for a certain thing. You need the agency folks there to bring their perspective and their utilitarian need of that study. But as the program officer, you're the one that gets to see all of those. And it could be that those people in that consensus discussion don't fully appreciate the background that those other folks are bringing. And so it's a really fun part of the job to think about that going forward. And if you do leave the academies, how you play that out in your next roles and in your next positions, because I think that's a really unique and valuable experience that a lot of people don't get to have. So, and I do have fun stories to tell. If you know about some of the board meetings and the after parties and things that used to happen at those in-person meetings. But I've promised I wouldn't share too many of them, but it's lovely to see everybody again. So thank you for the invitation, Sue.
I listen to this and I hear about parties. I hear about Dr. Pepper. I hear about road trips. What happened my 6 years?
This is my cue to give Bob permission to tell a third story.
Oh, I'm going to get that permission. Okay, well, I'm sorry, can I do it? Okay. This story is also about a liquid. It's not Dr. Pepper, and it's about someone who is here and who will be talking with me in just a few minutes about a report, but the story is not about that report. The story is about Margaret Leinan. Margaret Leinan and I go way back to the late 70s. She got a PhD in 1979, I believe, at Rhode Island. And we were in the faculty there for a number of years. We were in the administration for a number of years. And when I left Rhode Island to go to Texas, Margaret became the dean of the oceanography school there. And we have a number of things of interest that are in common. We both like and collect Navajo rugs, which are wonderful, wonderful things. And we also both like a liquid that is not Dr. Pepper. It's single malt Scotch whiskey. Actually, as a side story, I first had whiskey in Alaska. And from your predecessor as dean there, Vera Alexandra, was Vera Dugdale back in 1964. That's where it all started for me, for single malt Scotch. But Margaret loved single malt Scotch. And another thing we have in common, and this follows in from Jim Baker, who was the founder of the Oceanography Society and its first president. Arnold Gordon was the second president. Margaret was the third president of the Oceanography Society, and I was the fourth. And the fourth meeting was held in Paris. And Margaret, by that time, was at the National Science Foundation, and she so very kindly bought a very special bottle of Scotch to bring to me, to present to me as I became president of the Oceanography Society. Her favorite distillery is Talisker on the Isle of Skye. Mine is Macallan. And one of the iconic single malt Scotches anywhere is 25-year Macallan. I don't know how many hundreds of dollars Margaret paid for that bottle, but I checked last weekend on the price, and a 25-year Macallan now costs over $3,000 for one bottle. And I know it was hundreds in those times too. So as I said, Margaret was at NSF and she was flying to Paris, went to Dulles, put the bottle on the X-ray machine. It came out one end and fell off and broke. Margaret told me this when she got to Paris. I don't know who felt worse, Margaret or me, but she went and got another very nice, it was a vatted malt. It was very, very nice. But to this day, I have still never, and I collect single malt Scotches. I have 179 single malt Scotches in my collection. If any of you like Scotch and are near Austin, Texas, come by and try them. But I have still, to this day, never tasted 25-year Macallan. Thank you, Mark. But the important thing is, yes, the important thing was how thoughtful that was. And it cannot be appreciated more. I mean, the thought was worth a lot more than the bottle. Thank you, Margaret.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of our panelists. I don't know, Jim, did you have something else you wanted to share? I wasn't sure. Jim? Yeah.
There we go. I think the main thing I think is important about the Ocean Studies Board, and it certainly was for me, it's like a home away from home. At your own institution, you know the people there, and you have a relationship with the younger faculty and the older faculty and the students. But you're limited in the breadth of things that you can understand and do. And oceanography is such a broad subject that it's hard to have all of it in one place. And the Ocean Studies Board brings people together in that way. I think I said to Bruce Alberts at one point, I think in a way the Ocean Studies Board is most important for young scientists because it gives them a chance to talk to other scientists of their same age or older. They can see how the older oceanographers act, what they do when they sit at a committee meeting, how they intervene or what they do, how do they actually dress? All of these things that you're not necessarily going to learn at your own home institution. And there's no question that the Academy has played that role. And I think particularly in oceanography, because it is so broad in its disciplines. But to me, that's a critical role as the Academy in providing a home for young oceanographers to interact, and older ones too, to talk about new programs that you can't really do so easily when you're just sitting at home. So it's an important part of the American science establishment, and it's been particularly important for oceanography, and certainly been a lot of fun for me to be involved in lots of different phases of the Ocean Studies Board.
Yeah, so we have the usual duel between the chair and the director here. So, but it's my turn now.
It's always her turn.
Yeah, what can I say? So it's really a pleasure now kind of to move on to our next report. And so, yeah, if the panelists want to move or you want to stay, it's it doesn't matter. But we do have, this was really interesting as well in terms of the voting. So we had a lot of votes for several of the reports in the Marine Mammals and Noise or Marine Mammals and Sound series. But we also had a lot of votes for it as a series in the whole. So we gave people the option. You could say, I want to vote for this report, or I want to vote for the series. And we had, I think, maybe 3, and Oil in the Sea was one, and the Marine Mammals and Sound was the other. But to put together, this series probably garnered the most votes, but I didn't count it that way. But it certainly has been, I think, a very influential series through the years. And I'm so pleased that we have 3 people joining us, and Peter Tyak, who was on, I think, several of these. He was also a member of the Ocean Studies Board, and he chaired the last round of this. So it's really a pleasure to have Peter here. Mike Weiss, who's at the Office of Naval Research. And of course, Mike was the one, sort of the most recent one who was the program manager. So without Mike's initiative, that wouldn't have happened. And then Kim Waddell, who is the study director, and it's really a pleasure. Kim just happened to be in town. And so, he's currently at the University of the Virgin Islands. So it's really, a pleasure to welcome Kim back. And I will say, I know I've heard this from, more than one person, that the great joy of serving on one of Kim's committees is he has the best taste in restaurants and wine. So, so take it away.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been out of the country or away from the Washington, D.C. for about 5-6 years now. And it's really great to be back and see so many familiar faces. And following many of the previous comments, I too learned a great deal in my tenure here at the Ocean Studies Board. I'm a terrestrial ecologist by training, so I really felt like a fish out of water when I came here. But I had a chance to work with Sue when we were both study directors on a non-native oyster study and focusing on the Chesapeake, and my love of food and wine complemented the issue of oysters and champagne. So I endeared myself to her and the program here, and had a chance to work with her later when I had a chance to work with Larry Mayer on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. But today I'm going to speak more to the series of reports that we've done, that OSB has done on marine mammals and noise. And, you know, I'm so used to talking to much broader audiences, I forget that I'm stepping into, like, you know, the Hall of Fame of ocean sciences sometimes. And so some of my opening comments are fairly basic, but I'll start with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. That was, you know, that was really innovative policy that was developed in 1972. And it was an opportunity where we collectively, the federal government and the nation, recognized marine mammals as a, you know, valued natural resource that should be protected. But at the same time, it was recognized that human activities impact these animals. And so when the Marine Mammal Protection Act came up again for reauthorization in the early 90s, the debate really centered around the conflicting demands between protecting and conserving marine mammals and you know, allowing human activity that are considered important to the nation, some of the damages that they might impact marine mammals, and specifically low frequency sound. So this issue really garnered a lot of national attention because there was a proposal at the time to repeatedly measure the speed of sound in the ocean over time to help determine whether the ocean and the atmosphere were actually indeed warming up. And this was part of the acoustic thermometry of ocean climate, the ATOC. Anyway, low frequency sound, as all of you know, is an important research tool, both in geophysics, biological oceanography, and so forth. And so the NRC at the time formed a committee on low frequency sound under the auspices of Ocean Studies Board. And this was the first of 5 committees that span over the next 25 years. And so, as Sue mentioned, I had the privilege of working on that last report, the 2017 report, that looked at the topic of marine mammals, noise, and other stressors. So I'm just going to briefly recap the reports, just what they were trying to do, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues on the Zoom here. So the 1994 report, the initial report, that really provided an initial survey of our understanding of the impacts of noise on marine mammals. That was followed by the 2000 report that reviewed the research as part of that ATOC experiments. And then together, those 2 reports really sort of laid out a number of recommendations that some were followed, some were, like all NRC reports, some were ignored or pushed aside. But the 2003 report evaluated human and natural contribution to marine ambient noise and the trends. They also outlined the research needs to evaluate the impacts. They also wanted to identify gaps in the noise databases, what we understood, where we saw noise, and then finally make recommendations for developing a model for noise across sort of a spatial, temporal, frequency dependent variables. And then finally, in 2005, was the first report specifically focusing on biological significance, specifically the scientific challenges of using short-term observations at the level of individuals, but how that then predicts effects on populations. And so then the final report in that series, and again, the one that Peter Tyak and I were responsible for, that was the focused on the sound and other stressors. These are ocean acidification, anoxia, ocean warming, fishing, and pollution, just to mention a few. And so those cumulative stressors how do we measure them, evaluate them on marine mammals? So with that note, I'll turn it over to Peter to fill in the gaps if I missed anything in my introduction.
Thanks so much, Kim. Hello from Scotland. I'd like to just confirm that you're hearing okay.
Yes.
Does it sound okay?
Sound is good.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Sue. Yes, if we can go back one slide, I just would like to make a brief point about the progression that we have of these reports. The first report did a sort of a normal review of current knowledge and assessment of future needs, and also immediately pointed out regulatory problems. By the 2000 report, I'd just like to note a similarity to a comment that John Farrington made about impacts of oil as a stressor. The two series of reports are similar in one sense in that they look at the impact of two different stressors on the ocean environment. And in some sense, this is a very practical applied problem. But by 2000, it was really clear that it was advances in the underlying science, development and technology, and improvements in math and statistical analysis that was really critical for progress in the applied problem. And actually, there was an enormous amount of synergy back and forth between the societal recognition of how serious these two issues were and the developing science. So I think there is an important similarity there. By the 2003 report, this was led by an ocean acoustician, George Frisk, and this also emphasized the importance of modeling and databases, along with analyzing sources of sound and long-term trend, the kind of typical ocean science attention to scales of analysis. And I think that by this point, it was very important that one needed to think about developing models and thinking carefully about what field observations and controlled laboratory experiments were required to reduce our uncertainty. We then had a pretty big transition from a narrow focus on effects of noise in the short term on marine mammals to these impacts on populations. And I'd like to go to the next slide to show the basic structure of a model that this report came up with, which has been quite important in our area. It starts with the stressor sound on the upper left, and the pluses inside the box show that we really understand and can characterize the characteristics of natural and anthropogenic sound in the ocean very precisely. And we have reasonable evidence and methods to be able to predict what kind of changes in behavior occur because of exposure to sound, and some information about what impact these changes in behavior have on survival, feeding, breeding of the populations. But this report pointed out that we have basically no evidence on how those changes in those life functions affect the survival and reproduction of the whole population. Once we know changes in vital rates, then we have great methods to predict population effects. So this, I think, one of the important elements of this report was to point out a critical data gap, and led to a series of studies that Mike Weiss will describe later. So this stimulated a significant amount of research and had significant impacts on the regulatory structure. The next slide shows yet another stage of broadening, not just looking at short-term consequences of noise on behavior of marine mammals, but also it looks at a broader set of population consequences of cumulative exposure to multiple stressors. So the title of this report was Approaches to Understanding the Cumulative Effects of Stressors on Marine Mammals. And in terms of environmental assessment and policy, cumulative effects typically means what's the impact of a proposed human action given all of the past, present, and conceivable future actions that may be taken by humans. This report says that that is not a very useful way to try to estimate the impacts of multiple stressors. Rather, it takes a cumulative risk approach, similar to what the EPA has used for exposure to chemical stressors. And so this model shows that this general structure, it's a conceptual model showing that ecological drivers can affect the exposure to stressors. Those will change the physiology of different individuals. The physiology may change behavior, and both of those may change the health of an individual. And an important element of this model was developing a health box or a health indicator to help fill that gap that was present in the population consequences of disturbance model. And that yields in a similar pattern to vital rates and population dynamics. The thing that's different here is this is focusing on exposure to multiple stressors, not just noise. And it was in response to the need as studies developed less uncertainty about the impact of noise on marine mammals, then the issue about the cumulative impact of noise and other stressors raised to the fore. And this report has basically highlighted that we have neither the analytical methods nor the data to answer the regulatory requirements for estimating cumulative effects. The next slide will show some continuous trends across these different themes, even though they focused on slightly different elements. By the 1994 report, I mentioned they talked about regulatory issues. And this report raised the point that there are really serious problems with a single threshold, sort of like a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit for sound, above which the probability of response is 1 and below which the probability of response is 0. The 2000 report also highlighted these issues. And by 2014, Mike is going to describe the development of research projects which led to papers that could develop probabilistic dose response functions for marine mammal behavioral responses to sound. The 2017 report emphasizes the importance of dose response functions for each stressor to predict how different stressors may interact. And research that was stimulated by these reports has demonstrated that using that all or nothing threshold, which US and many international regulators use to regulate sound, they underestimate the number of animals disturbed by a factor of about 280. So if you use the dose response curve on the upper right to predict whether animals will be affected by sound, and use a normal sound propagation profile typical of many places where these animals live, on the bottom map, the red dots indicate animals expected to respond, and the black dots indicate animals expected not to respond. The 0.5 probability of response occurs in a tiny area near the center of this, and very few animals are involved here. As you go further out, there's such large areas of low exposure, but exposure at which some animals may respond, that drives the total number of animals taken. So this kind of analysis has shown that the current procedures by which the US and many nations estimate the impact of sound are fundamentally flawed and really need to be changed and incorporate those response functions to answer these questions. And if we hit it won't be a next slide, but next image here, Mike, that will show data that there's been work since the 2017 report, a new paper that explores how to estimate the response surface for interactions between two stressors when the two different stressors affect the same response. This explores both empirical and theoretical ways to narrow our uncertainty about that. So this work has led to, I think, to important highlighting of areas where we have ignorance, both in terms of theoretical methods and data, and is moving towards providing answers to these questions in ways that I certainly would never have anticipated when we were starting each report. I'd like to now switch to Mike, who will be describing the further development of projects and regulatory impact.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Hi, Mike. We can hear you very clearly.
Great. Well, good morning. I know we're running on time here, so I'll try to be quick. So I did want to provide an agency or funding sponsor kind of perspective on some of these different reports. I think it's safe to say some of those early reports were influential, if not foundational, to the creation of the ONR program and the other Navy programs, and hugely influential with other agencies and the focus on sound. So I think that's safe to say. I came in the door about 2008, where the 2005 report pictured here was hot off the presses. Our purpose in our ONR's topic with the PCOT is to develop these statistical models linking both behavior and physiology. The newest model pictured down in the bottom right there, or newer model in 2013, linking those to the biologically significant effects. I do want to say, though, stepping back with the working groups, we started in 2009, a second round that took us through about 2015. We started with, really exploring if, and we could even translate these into mathematical frameworks. So this conceptual model, could we even make that link between short-term disturbance and population level effects? So it was really exploratory at the beginning. So I think, while today it's being applied across a number of different systems and by investigators around the world, I think it's important to recognize back at the beginning, it was very exploratory in nature, thanks to the 2005 report for framing that up. We started with case studies listed there, elephant seals, led by one of your OSD members, Dan Costa at Santa Cruz, bottlenose dolphins, North Atlantic right whales, and beaked whales. You'll see a theme across several of the projects here where we try to get that taxonomic breadth across marine mammal species types to explore the application and development and application of these models. After the working groups, we continue down this thread. This has been an area of kind of multiple millions of dollars of investment over the last decade plus. So today, again, there's a suite of models that can be used and are being applied in different areas. They are very data hungry, so that does limit it, but the models really are well developed. Let's see. Trying to get to the next slide here. Oh, there we go. Moving on again, just you've seen this from Peter's report. I do want to mention the cumulative effects report pictured there are co-sponsors with NOAA, BOEM, and Marine Mammal Commission. So definitely multiple agency interest in this topic. But a very difficult question, trying to look at multiple stressors and also the interaction of those stressors. So I want to really tip my hat to SERDP, the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. A couple of years after the 2017 report, SERDP was willing to take on the topic. They work closely with Navy on some of those topics that might be quite difficult and out of reach. So we partnered with them using a similar framework with the working group, and then several funded studies listed there. Again, you'll notice across taxonomic species from dolphins to right whales, and again, elephant seals. And then one additional project at the bottom there, ONR partnered up with the Department of Energy doing some gray whale work off the Oregon coast. So again, a series of products here that really are trying to, again, acting as case studies to explore the interaction of those stressors, again, if they're additive, synergistic, or potentially even antagonistic. One exciting additional development, this was conceptual, but now in practice, is we started this with marine mammals, working with SERDP back in 2020, with the idea that down the line, and it turns out as of this year, SERDP is now funding a handful of studies looking at multiple stressors in terrestrial systems. So we're very excited with Peter's lead on the cumulative effects group to start interacting with that terrestrial group to start sharing notes and whatnot. One slide here, it might seem off topic, going back to the 2005 report. There was one recommendation in there, recommendation number 4, that suggested that we needed to assess the stress response in marine mammals to explore that physiological response and the influence it might have on populations. This is an area, this is one project listed here. This came out of Dan Costa's lab with Dan Crocker at Sonoma State leading it. But just an example of one of many studies that we initiated starting in 2011 to really explore this topic of the physiological response, starting with a lot of the glucocorticoid steroids and looking at these various sample matrices, developing those so we could understand what we were seeing, blood, fur, microcy, blubber. Became clear that baseline was critical because those changed quite a bit. And hormones, unfortunately, are messy and all that variability. So some of the other markers have been developed across multiple species now using proteomics and metabolomics. And again, in the bottom right there is pictured that physiological link. Link from physiological change to that health box is where that stress topic has really developed and continues to this day. So starting back again from the 2005 report recommendation number 4. And then the last slide, this is again the 2013 representation of the PCOD conceptual model disturbance all the way over to population level effects. And overlaid on that is really the regulatory framework in the US. And this has really helped us to start thinking about, since the late 2000s, how we're doing these risk assessment models. So we are understanding that a lot of the exposure, right, the sound exposure modeling that all agencies are required to do to assess their potential effects, that's on the left side of this model, whereas then the regulator is required to do a negligible impact determination and then issue letters of authorization for Navy activities and other activities across the board. And so you can see that's quite a span when you're looking at that model. So it's become critically important, not only in being able to implement those models, but I think it's been foundational in how we think about the sound exposure modeling and linking that to negligible impact determination. So it's been hugely influential. And to this day, we continue with Navy and other agencies, I believe, having discussions with the regulator about making that link between the modeling and the negligible impact determination. So again, it all comes back to that 2005 report. And again, the influential, I think the 2017 report is, we're just kind of getting the train out of the station on a number of studies, a lot of exciting work, but very excited to see where that goes over the coming years. So with that, we'll thank everybody for their time and attention. And of course, thanks the academies for their support in this series of sound on marine mammals.
Thank you, Peter and Mike. And yeah, just again, I know you can't hear it, but we had a nice round of applause for your presentations today. And then, so now we're going to move on. The next winner of our greatest hits is a review of the Ocean Research Priorities Plan and Implementation Strategy. And it gives me the opportunity to reintroduce Bob Deuce, who was a co-chair of that committee, and also Margaret Lynan, who at the time was at NSF. So Bob, are you going to lead off?
I'll just have a few starting remarks. Yes, Nancy Target was a co-chair of this committee. What we're going to do, Margaret and I, is Margaret is going to give the background for the whole, not only our report, but of course the Ocean Research Priority Plan that was developed amongst the many agencies. This was a very exciting effort in those times, and Margaret was right in the middle leading that effort. And then I'll say a little bit about the Academy's report, which was a review of that effort. And then Margaret will finish up with a little bit about the impact of both our Academy report and the Ocean Research Priority Plan report. So Margaret.
Great, thanks, Bob. This, like the report that Larry talked about, was a little different. It wasn't the Academy deciding to articulate research priorities, but the group of federal agencies doing that and then saying to the Academy, we'd like to have this reviewed. And I'd like to give a little bit of history in the same way that Jim Baker did about the internal to the federal government, the role of oceans and groups that look at oceans in an integrative fashion. So the administrative input to the US government comes through on science, comes through the National Science and Technology Council, which was first formed in 1993 under President Clinton. And one of the committees of that council is the Committee on Environment, Natural Resources, and now Sustainability. And Jim Baker was one of the chairs of that committee. You can see the tracks, the large footprints of Jim Baker across our field for decades. And the CENR at the time had several subcommittees, but nothing related to the ocean. The ocean was subsumed in other committees. In 2004, when the Bush administration came in, it created the Committee on Ocean Policy as a high-level group to advise the federal government on oceans. And it created the Joint Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology as a working level group. And joint was because it reported to both the Committee on Ocean Policy and the CENR. And that it comprised the primary representatives of ocean S&T at all of the agencies of federal government that either did that or had an interest in it. And so it was a new committee, and NOAA and NSF were to be co-chairs of the committee together with OSTP. So Rick Spinrad was the head of Ocean and Atmosphere Research at the time. So he was the NOAA representative. I was the head of Geoscience. So I was the NSF representative. And David Halpern was on detail to OSTP. So he became the OSTP representative, and we were co-chairs. And we had several of those interesting after hours discussions about what this group could do and what was the most important thing for it to do, given that it was brand new and could decide what role it should have. And we decided early on that what we would do was challenge the group to set priorities for ocean research. And we were taking as a model the US Global Change Research Program, which had a little more trouble establishing priorities, but it attempted to do that. We did not know whether we could do that, but we had a remarkable set of colleagues at the JSOST at the time, Jack Kay from NASA, Frank Herr from ONR, and Tom Drake was also involved. Dave Balton from State, Jim Kendall from what is now BOEM, and others. But that group was really the group that said, yes, we'll help you, make sure that we get to priorities. So I asked Rick and David Halpern to give me anecdotes as well. So the first one comes from Rick. My first anecdote involves the then young woman who was my Sea Grant fellow and whose first task was to help me staff for the JSOST, and that was the remarkable Shelby Walker. She went on to one of our first meetings, which had the usual mix of insight, witty banter, and a touch of nuanced snarkiness from a few of the participants, not to be named. After the meeting, I asked her what she thought of the meeting, and she said, nobody seemed to agree, but they were all so much more polite than I thought they would be. And I thought that summed it up nicely. So because this was meant to be an administrative committee and administrative priorities, we really had no mandate to go out to the community. But, having come from the community, we knew that we needed to do that. So we developed a couple of public sessions, and the largest one was in Denver. And one of Dave Halpern's comments from that was, during the all hands community-wide meeting in Denver, I really learned the meaning of the DC expression of how making policy is similar to making sausage. Another anecdote from Rick. The second anecdote comes from comes when we were at the stage of aggressively engaging the user community. We agreed that we should bring in as diverse a group of stakeholders as possible, and we met in a large auditorium in Denver. It was an extraordinary meeting, including educators, researchers, conservationists, politicians, lobbyists, environmentalists, industry types, students, coastal managers, etc. Do you remember at one point, one of the speakers stood up and started by stating that he thought he was at a Village People concert? I nearly wet my pants and the mental image never faded. After several efforts where we thought it would fall apart because of lack of agreement or lack of the agencies allowing the representative to agree to prioritization where their priorities were not the top one or two. We had been talking to the Academy for some time about reviewing the document. And we agreed that a review of an advanced draft would really be helpful, because then we could respond to it instead of giving you the final draft and then, you know, taking the slings and arrows. So that was how the committee came to be, how the decision to do priorities came to be, and how we asked the Academy. So with that, I will turn it over to Bob.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. You can see that Margaret and I are breaking new ground here because we're not using PowerPoint. And I'm sorry about that, but that's what we felt to do. Margaret pointed out that the report was really in two parts. The first part, a draft, which came after the Denver meeting, and our committee was at the Denver meeting and participated in that meeting as well, that we were to review that part and then
It may have been Bob that thought it was, it may have been Bob that thought it was the Village People.
I wish I'd been that smart to think of that, but I didn't, unfortunately. And the second part, so we reviewed the first part. The second part, they revised the plan and also put an implementation part on that second part. So there were some successes of the first part. The central link between the ocean and society was very well articulated. It was very clear. They had 6 broad themes, among them climate, ecosystem health, human health, etc. And they captured most of the ocean-related issues facing our society. The role of research in improving technology and monitoring and management and fundamental understanding of the ocean was well articulated and recognized, and research priorities in the social sciences were also included. So those were some of the successes of the first part of the report. And we had some recommendations on that. We thought that there wasn't really a bold and compelling vision for the future of ocean sciences research in that early draft, and we suggested that that should be provided. And a more comprehensive description of the needs and opportunities for multidisciplinary research and partnerships could be included as well. We felt that the goals and challenges and research priorities of the plan could be related better perhaps to existing programs that already were in place, as well as the new initiatives. And finally, maybe a section on cross-cutting elements that are central to the overall vision should be included. So they came out with, just a few months later, a second draft. And the successes of the second draft were very significant. They had thoughtfully considered the comments by our committee, but also from the community, because the community was involved in this all the way along. And they had developed a really clear vision, clear and coherent vision statement, which was part of the document. It was restructured, much more readable, et cetera. It was really a much stronger document. And they provided a clear executive summary. We still had some recommendations, but they were mainly that as this program developed, that the external committees should be established to provide independent and credible advice to the JSOST as this moved along. And a program office should be set up, and finally continue and expand their regular outreach to the community. concerning the activities and progress and planning of the ocean research priorities and implementation strategy. That's what we did. I should point out that Marcia McNutt was one of the reviewers of our report. Ken Brink was in charge of looking at our response to the reviewers of our report and whether we had done a good job with doing that. And Jim Sancharico, who is left, was actually a committee member on this report. And I'll move it back to Margaret now for comments.
Thanks, Bob. One of the things he didn't say was the committee was especially critical of the fact that we had 20 priorities. So did we really have priorities? And that I believe every one of them started with better understand, blah, blah, blah. You know, the words I tell everybody, never put that in. Now I say that, and that they really weren't priorities. They were saying, you know, understand the ecology of the ocean or something. So when the new report came out, the executive summary that Bob talked about really had the priorities in it. And to emphasize that, they were in a different color font than the others. And they were develop the capability to forecast key ocean and ocean influence processes and phenomena, provide scientific support for ecosystem-based management, and deploy an ocean observing system. Those are priorities. And I think that when we look back, this was the time at which the agencies really started looking at developing actionable models by putting together observations and scientific models. And that many of the models we use now for example, sea level rise hazards, for dealing with harmful algal blooms and so forth, derived from that approach of not saying, you know, give us a scientific model, but give us a scientific model that together with observations can be used to reduce harm, to take action. And I think that was, and NOAA, of course, was a real leader in that, since that's their responsibility. The scientific support for ecosystem-based management. The community had been talking about ecosystem-based management for a long time, but it hadn't made its way into the that being the focus. For example, with fisheries, it was, you know, manage the fishery by managing catch rather than manage the fishery by ecosystem-based management. And this was really, I think that the government really took that on board. And then, of course, the ocean observing system in all of its multifaceted incarnations has been a major continuing commitment from the government. And you know, I know from the outside, you know, we wish that there was more, but I always said, you know, the community wants us to measure every single parameter in perpetuity, and it's not going to happen. But I think that there were real advantages. And then Dave Halpern, in another one of his comments, was that he thought the most important legacy was that this ocean subcommittee in the federal government was put in place and continues, and that it set priorities and has set priorities every time, you know, multiple times since. Independent of party affiliation of the administration, and although the names on the bodies are slightly altered by every new administration. So that's some of the impacts.
I'm a storyteller, so I have to tell one more story, but if it was related to this, at the Denver meeting, which had somewhere between 250 and 300 people, I think it was quite large, not as large as they'd hoped, but it was still quite large. It was at a hotel, and the meeting ended in the afternoon, and then people could go get their flights. And so when I checked out of the hotel, I put my suitcase in my car in the garage, in the trunk, and went down to the meeting. When the meeting was over, I came back to my car, opened the trunk to put my computer in there, and the car had been rifled. My suitcase was wide open. Everything was thrown all over the place. But fortunately, I had not put my computer in there. And so I really didn't lose too much. But that's one of the things that I will always remember about this report.
Well, thank you both to Bob and Margaret for that. And I'll also thank Margaret for reaching out to Rick and to Dave as well to get their feedback. It was really enriching, I think, to get their feedback too. Now we're going to move on. The next report is from 2010, and it's Ocean Acidification, a National Strategy to Meet the Challenges of a Changing Ocean. And Libby Jewett is here with us, and online is Jorge Corredor, who is one of the committee members.
Well, thank
And
you.
are you
Mary.
You're
Thank you
starting?
very much, Sue.
Good. Thank you,
Go
Jorge.
ahead. All right, very well. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to say hello to all those old friends on the board that are there today. And like somebody said, it's like another family. So a pleasure to be back with you again. The subject of our talk today is ocean acidification, as you can see from the title, but the title has a subtitle. It's not ocean acidification alone. It's a national strategy to meet the challenges of a changing ocean, which brings to mind Dr. Baker's talk earlier this morning about how science and policy can come together difficultly, but we're doing our best. So the origins of this study are two acts of Congress. One of them, can I have the next slide, please? The first is the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Management Reauthorization Act. This is a 30-year-old act that is tried true and has strong bipartisan support. So there was no doubt it would be reauthorized, but the anecdote of the New York Times is that a representative from Washington State slipped this in at the last minute at 3 o'clock in the morning. And what he slipped in, next slide, please, was this, pardon me, go back, was this indication that the Secretary of Commerce shall request the National Research Council to conduct a study of the acidification of the oceans and how this process affects the United States. And not only that, but next was the Forum Act of 2007, following close on its heels, a bill to establish an interagency committee to develop an ocean acidification research and monitoring plan to establish an ocean acidification program within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So there you go, an act that can be acted upon. Next, please. Next slide. Okay, the federal sponsors, pardon me, go back. The federal sponsors were, of course, NOAA, which was called upon, and the National Science Foundation, NASA, and the USGS stepped up as well. These three agencies, together with NOAA, have been very active in ocean acidification, as has been EPA. Next slide, please. The statement of task, was, of course, to review the current knowledge, to identify critical uncertainties in impacts and information to facilitate research, decision-making for mitigation and adaptation. And of course, the recommendation that research and monitoring and assessment for federal agencies, the scientific community, and other partners, including a strategy for developing a comprehensive coordination agency program to address the high priority information needs. So fortunately, Dr. Libby Jewett is here with us today, and she will talk about the implementation. Next, please. So just to set the stage for what we knew at the moment, and this is around about 2009, 2010, And the ocean acidification community, which had been a quiet little community, was now on the spotlight. And fortunately, there had been a number of papers that had come out. And I point to the first one in the middle, a robust decadal time series of pH and CO2. By that time, our colleagues at the HOT station, the Hawaii Ocean Time Station, had already established a decadal view of ocean acidification, that is the loss of pH, the decrease in pH, and had correlated it very closely to partial pressure of CO2 in the ocean. And not only that, but to the Mauna Loa Observatory observations. So we had unequivocal proof of ocean acidification. Not only that, but up at the right-hand corner, top right-hand corner, we also found out round about then in a Revell lecture delivered by Ken Caldera, in which he opened our eyes to the decadals, to the millennial scale of the problem, and how we might find ourselves in an acid bath. The folks at Plymouth, I believe, Plymouth Lab, talk about hot, sour, and breathless, the ocean that we're going to have round about then. Hot because of the high temperatures, sour because of the acidification, and breathless because of the lack of oxygen due to the heat. So over to the right, there was also a lot of information about the impairment of calcification in some marine organisms, but there was much doubt about what organisms were affected and what organisms were not affected. So there was a gap in research right there, from which we'll hear later on today. There were many other things, like down at the lower right, Dr. Malero's work on the change in speciation in heavy metals, which can be toxic. This is an example for copper, saying that up to 20% of the copper in the ocean will be released into the free form, which is the toxic form. And then again, a noisier ocean on the bottom left-hand corner, depicting sections across the Pacific and Atlantic, indicating how the ocean is getting noisier in the top levels, because this is down to 1,000 meters, and how the oceans have already gotten noisier due to acidification. So with this on our plate, and I might say also that the committee was star-studded as usual, because the board is very careful in choosing the members of the committee, star-studded except for the messenger here, who's just a member of the committee and a member of the board. I get the idea I was the watchman. In any case, Dr. Francois Morel, who was our chair, was not able to attend, so the duty came to me. In any case, you will all recall that the board is very meticulous in choosing the members of the committees. But not only that, if you think you know very much about ocean acidification or any subject you bring up to the board, you'll know that the board knows better, and the board will bring along another selection of top-notch investigators who will teach you the finer points before they even let you put pencil to paper. So after that crash course, then you get to start writing your report. So next slide, please. So the key messages are to be expected. Ocean chemistry is changing at an unprecedented rate due to anthropogenic effects. The changes in seawater chemistry are expected to affect marine organisms that use carbonate to build shells or skeletons. And indeed, there's the toxic nature of the heavy metals, so that must be included too. And it is currently not known how various marine organisms will acclimate or adapt to the chemical changes resulting from acidification. Next, please. And the national program elements are also what would be expected. And I'll let Libby talk to that. And the next slide, please. A global network, of course, and improvement of the acidification analysis parameters. And finally, the next one, which is our brag sheet, but we've heard much better brag sheets today, so I won't even go through it. Thank you very much. And I think Libby will be talking to us now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jorge. Great to see you there up on the screen. So I'm Libby Jewett, and I am director of NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, which I was actually hired to found in 2011. So NOAA was both a sponsor and an executing agency, and it's been really thrilling to see the progress that we've made over the past decade. I would say with certainty that we've come a long way. And the National Academy study report really laid out the foundation for the work that we've done over the past decade. It was talking about the observing network. It talked about the development of a national program. And I think we've delivered on many of those. However, there's so much more that we need to understand. So next slide. Okay. Yep. So you can go to the next slide and then just click down and I'll kind of speak to that. So obviously the 4M Act actually ended up passing in 2009, and I would hazard a guess that the National Academy's study group was convening as the 4M Act was sort of moving forward, and likely the same people were influencing both sides of that. So it was really exciting to have both the legislation, but also this like critical report that was coming out and indicating the work we needed to do. I'll also note that this really important thing was happening on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest, and that we were having the oyster hatchery die-offs in just several years prior to this. And now we have an economic driver also pushing all of this effort forward. So I think if we hadn't had all these things sort of congealing at the same time, we may not have made as much progress as we have. So through the 4M Act, that set up, and so you can keep clicking through, set up the interagency working group on ocean acidification. I think there were named agencies, maybe 7 or 8 in the act. We now have 13, probably and counting, that sit on the interagency working group. I chair that. So we have the NOAA OA program was established also in the 4M Act. And the chair of the interagency working group is dictated by law to be chaired by NOAA. So it's like a great cohesive approach. The Federal Strategic Research Plan, which originally came out in 2013, we were reading the National Academy study as we were developing that plan, as we were doing also in NOAA when we were developing our OA research plan. So like the Marine CDR work, which we were just hearing about earlier today, these National Academy studies, especially the sort of ones that are like early in the process, really can influence the sort of trajectory of the work. A couple of things I'll note here, right? In sort of the 20 to 20, every couple of years, we have to report out on the spending across all the federal agencies. When we started that, we were spending maybe a total of under 20, maybe 12 a year, and now we're up to 55 million a year across all of the agencies. We've gotten really good at working together and knowing, what is happening where. So that also has improved. We currently now are going to be setting up an OA advisory board. So any of you who might be interested in helping to have some influence on the interagency working group, that's in the process, and you'll see FRNs and other public notices coming out over the course of the next year. We, in the newer form, so we've been reauthorized now a couple of times. And again, in the original National Academy's report already was talking about the social sciences, that we needed to bring the human component and potential impacts into the research. that already was starting to happen. And with the recent reauthorizations, we are about to release a national vulnerability assessment for covering the entire country, bringing the impacts and potential impacts and connecting that to humans. So it's a pretty powerful report, and, stay tuned, keep an eye out for that. We also, through the legislation, and as part of kind of the broader framework of working on OA, we need to get the information out to people and enable people to share information so we can catalyze, kind of leap forward in terms of the work that we need to do. We developed, through the Interagency Working Group, an Ocean Acidification Information Exchange, which anyone can join. You just have to let us know who you are, own up and tell us your affiliations, and you can also participate in that exchange. So next slide. So now, and that actually is a good point. Because of all of this, the National Academies Report and the Interagency Working Group and the work that NOAA's been doing, I can with confidence say that the US is the international leader on OA research. We have more publications than any other country by a large degree. So that's really exciting to see. We work collaboratively across the world. We're enabling capacity building work in developing countries. So it's again, coming back to the National Academies, I think it was really leapfrogged us in so many directions. And the Europeans were ahead of us when we started. So now we're working together, and I feel like we caught up and surpassed. So next slide. So in terms of the NOAA OA program, and you can just click through. Yeah. So in 2010, we came out with our research plan. So that was like, we were kind of working together and listening and seeing what the National Academies was coming out with. And we just recently came out with our most recent 2020 decadal plan. In the program, we now have a long-term OA observing network that is quite extensive, not as extensive as scientists might think that we need. As Margaret said, we can't measure everything all the time everywhere, but we're getting closer to that. And we do have, and NOAA sort of, although NSF actually invests a lot in observing as well, and we coordinate across. We have long-term time series represented by moorings that are both in the open ocean and in coastal systems. We have dedicated coastal cruises around almost all of our US coasts, including in the Pacific Islands. We are developing new technologies, and this is like cutting edge right now, to look at OA parameters on gliders and floats and other autonomous systems. Again, in order to make sure that we're collecting data that's relevant for modelers who need that broader coverage and higher time series. We're doing lots of biological impacts research, and I would say that's NOAA across all of the agencies, including the development of ecological models. We have funded many biogeochemical models, both regional ocean ones and Earth system models. We're doing these regional vulnerability assessments now, where we're bringing social scientists together with biologists, together with ocean chemists, to be able to connect the entire system and predict where vulnerabilities may exist, or where we need to do more research because people are reliant on resources that are potentially vulnerable to ocean acidification. And are there any adaptation actions that we can take there? And we continue to move out robustly on outreach and education. We've been able to engender a pretty broad bipartisan support in Congress. So I feel like we're doing a pretty good job on that. Next slide. And this is the last one. So big leaps. So I obviously, in the time that I have, am not going to be able to give you a full overview of all of the progress that we've made. And I'm happy to talk with people on the break and provide you with more resources. But I would say one of the biggest things is that when the National Academies Report came out, we were very focused on the open ocean. And we thought the open ocean really reflected kind of what was happening everywhere. Well, the coastal ocean is a much more complicated system. However, I feel like we actually have made a lot of progress in understanding how it's the same, how it's different, what the drivers are. You know, frankly, if there's more CO2, organisms don't care where that comes from, whether it comes from the atmosphere or it comes from phytoplankton that's decomposing in the bottom water. So it's a complicated system, but we are, you know, we're now through these long-term observing systems and ship surveys have, you know, detected and now know that ocean acidification is outside of pre-industrial conditions in the open ocean all of the time. However, in the coastal ocean, because of that variability, it's just going to take longer to see how that trend develops. Some systems have very successful replanting of seagrass beds, and now the pH is going up, which complicates seeing the ocean acidification signal. But I think we're beginning to get a handle on that. Every system is different. Many systems are different. We're actually also now just recently monitoring in the Great Lakes. Not something we were thinking about in the early days, and not something we had the funding for, frankly. You know, obviously marine life is vulnerable. And on the whole, if you look at meta-analyses, we'll see that the marine life in general is having a negative response to ocean acidification, but there is also resilience in many populations. Sometimes in, you know, even comparing populations that are in estuaries versus outside of estuaries, you'll see resilience in those organisms in estuaries that have been exposed to varying carbonate chemistry over time. So it's a complicated picture. In general, I would say, and I'm sure many of you would agree with me, we know way more about the chemistry than we do about the biology. And we have tested thousands of species now. If you look across the world, and if you even look across the US, lots of incredible research that's been done. And I would say now we're trying to move into detecting those impacts in the field versus in lab experiments. And that's a much more trickier enterprise. But I think we're going to figure it out. And there are efforts to do that on some of our ship surveys and through OMICS and other approaches. But that was identified in the National Academy study, and it continues to be an area that we need to do more work in. We have to do work in a multi-stressor environment. That's what the real world is for organisms, for marine life. And so in the early days, we really focused on just ocean acidification and kind of pulling out that stressor. But in fact, we got to look at how organisms are responding to ocean acidification and rising temperature and deoxygenation, because that's all happening. And setting up lab experiments to be able to do that is obviously a complicated process. However, on marine CDR, I'll say that the ocean acidification community and the groundwork that we've laid on science is critical and will be the foundation for the ocean CDR work as well. And we're seeing that the same researchers who developed their hypotheses and work in ocean acidification are now the ones that are being looked to when we try and look at marine CDR, clearly related. And I think I had a last one, which may have been, if you want to click, yeah, more research. More research is needed on all fronts. We actually did an analysis of the costs of implementing the federal research strategy, and we're underfunded by we're about at like 20% of what we need in order to really make headway on all of the gaps that we've identified. However, more work to be done, and yay, National Academies, thank you. I don't know, Jorge, you didn't have anything else to add.
Well, I did have a question to you, Libby, and that is about the progress in the interagency working group. I wanted to say that as far as intra-NOAA, I personally participated in many of these works in which we did acidification. And we did acidification in the context of the coastal ocean observing systems. For my part, it was Ayocaribe, and it was, pardon me, Caracus. And these efforts have been very successful. But my question to you is, as far as the interagency working group and the stovepipes between the agencies, what progress have you made?
Well, that's a pet peeve of mine, and definitely something that we've been trying to break down over time. We obviously meet very often. We've approached our collaborative work in different ways. We actually invite other agencies in to review our plans when we're deciding what investments we're making in NOAA, with the hope that they'll reveal if they're doing work that may be redundant with what we're doing. We share what's happening in particular regions. One of the really big successes is that every year NOAA, we fund a research cruise in a particular region, and I think we have just this past year we focused on the East Coast. And when we do that, before we do that, we talk to the other agencies and say, are you doing any other work that could leverage this cruise? And two of the other agencies in particular, actually the National Park Service also does observing in the parks. And so we make sure we try and collaborate in a way that they take observations close to the coast and the parks at the same time that the cruise is doing the transect offshore. And then the park data actually becomes part of the cruise data set. And so we have this sort of, offshore to inshore coverage. The same has been true with the EPA estuary programs. They have been sort of building up their ability to measure ocean acidification parameters, in particular in estuaries. And Narragansett Bay, for instance, there is monitoring that goes on there. And so again, we try and do that coordination. We've done the same thing on the West Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's been a really great way that we've sort of very specifically and tangibly coordinated our work across agencies, because it is easy to get stovepiped. But I think one of the advantages of the interagency is that you can, if you really work at it, you can make sure that the work is leveraged as much as possible.
Well, thank you for that, Liddy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both. I think have a round of applause for them.
Thank you.
And now for our last report in this decade, it's going to be, actually I lost my page.
It's me.
It's Rena. Yes, of course.
It's me. Thank you.
Yes, critical infrastructure, and it's Rena Fine and Deb Glickson. And I should say that Deb was a program officer when she was working. She's now a board director, but she's doing the board on Earth Sciences and Resources and the Water Science and Technology Board. So
She is, yes. So I thank you for helping us to celebrate ourselves. We don't do that enough in the ocean. Two things I want to point out are excellence and this idea of consensus. And sometimes the two don't go together, but at the Academy they do. And that's an important thing. Others have discussed what an enriching experience this has been. For me, being on these reports, it's been marvelous in terms of the collaboration with people as well as the science. Colleagues, great. And the staff, amazing. So I want to thank both you and Morgan, who I've served under, for the excellent people like Deb Glickson, like Dan Walker, that you bring to these committees. So I think I hand it over now to Deb.
Thanks, Raina. I'll pay you later. So I wanted to just briefly mention the statement of task for this study, critical infrastructure for ocean research and societal needs in 2030. And I will say that I feel like we got lucky. We had a number of stellar report covers, but this was one of the most interesting. It was based on a workshop that we did during the study, and we had a scientific illustrator from Woods Hole Oceanographic who basically sketched out all the things that we talked about. And so if you ever have a chance to look at the hard copy of this, it actually wraps all the way around. It is the coolest cover I ever made. So the statement of task for this, this was a study that was sponsored by the Subcommittee for Ocean Science and Technology, which we'll talk about on another slide. And it basically was to identify the major research questions that were anticipated to be at the forefront of ocean science in 2030, and then to think about the categories of infrastructure that needed to be included in planning. You may recognize, if you were here this morning, that there's some, similarities to the last thing I tried to talk about. And in that, we wanted to really look at what are the new technological and scientific developments, what's the interdependence of different assets, how changes in the system might affect the demand on infrastructure, how you could use infrastructure for multiple goals, the potential for emerging technologies, which actually Dave Titley sort of talked against earlier, and then potential opportunities to phase out programs, which is always an interesting one that you very rarely ever see in the world of oceanography. How might you get rid of something that you don't need anymore? All right, next slide, please. I'm going to pass it back to Raina.
So I'm going to talk about the committee for a second. Eric Barron was the chair, and during this period, he was busy negotiating to be president of Penn State. So that left Deb to pick up the pieces, and which she did. We had a terrific committee. Okay, Deb.
Oh, back to me. All right, so next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the origin of this, it actually started in 2004 with the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy, where they recommended a renewed commitment to ocean science and technology, and they formed the Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology. And SOST asked OSB to help to think about what future research infrastructure needs might be for the ocean in 2030. And Raina pulled another old report that we did, Science at Sea, about how the fleet would be needed to think about these increasingly complex, multidisciplinary, multi-investigator projects, which has really turned out to be quite true. And then there is a nice definition of ocean research infrastructure, which I'm going to let you read on your own. Next slide, please. So the main recommendations, and I hacked these up, so they are not exactly the same as they are in the report, but basically that the federal ocean agencies should establish and share a coordinated national strategic plan. So they really need to think together about how ocean infrastructure could, how you would invest in it, how you would maintain it, and when you might retire things. And that the development and maintenance and replacement of these assets needed to be prioritized based on, first on science, then on the affordability, efficiency, and longevity of those assets, and then their idea about how they might contribute to other missions or applications. Another thing, again, which was, we've heard it in other reports, that there needed to be a review of these shared ocean research assets. And the way that they set this whole thing up in the report was that there were these 4 themes that the committee considered as being really important: enabling stewardship of the environment, protecting life and property, promoting economic vitality, and then increasing fundamental scientific understanding. Next slide, please. And so in terms of impacts, basically, I don't think I wrote a report that was in the Ocean Studies Board that didn't say something about that ships are going to continue to be incredibly important, because they are. And so, basically the idea was that there really needed to be a comprehensive long-term, research plan for research fleet to retain access to the sea. And that's been in numerous UNOLS reports. It's been in many academies reports. It's been in every report I can think of. That there's a capability needed to access fully and partially ice-covered seas. This was coming out before the Sikuliaq was brought online. And now there is an idea for planned Coast Guard icebreakers and for an NSF Antarctic research vessel. So we're seeing sort of a refreshing of that need for partially and fully ice covered seas. Support for continued innovation in ocean infrastructure development, in which case we've seen a lot in the last, decade and a half. And one example is in situ biogeochemical sensors. And then another quote from this was sort of the next generation has to have a competitive and innovative ocean research enterprise. And that included technology, maturation and validation, but also promoting education and training. Next slide, please. I'm gonna
So
pass this back to Rena.
when Deb and I talked, she said to me, well, do you have any funny things or anything you think of about this report? And I said, no, not really. The thing that stood out to me was how many good recommendations there were that still haven't been implemented. And Deb said, gee, we're on the same page here. So this idea of this shared infrastructure being reviewed on a regular basis was noted in the Sea Change report and in Sustaining Ocean Observation Study and the workshop report. The idea of maximizing societal benefit to develop, maintain, or the replacement of ocean infrastructure assets should be prioritized based on something logical like usefulness, affordability, ability to contribute to other missions, as in also discussed in the Sustaining Ocean Observations report. This encouragement of high-risk activities noted in the UN Decade, Larry Margaret's report. And I will say here that idea of having your ocean shot was just marvelous. I personally watched some younger colleagues work with that, and I hope that that continues to go. It was really, that was good stuff. And the last thing, this substantial collaboration that's needed amongst the agencies, we all know that that's been discussed before. I thank you.
I'm going to add one more thing to the end of this slide. Sorry, Raina. I think the thing I would add about this is that I know most people in this room are probably very familiar with SOST, but this report was sponsored by 13 different federal agencies. And to be honest, I think that's one of the reasons why when you look at that line at the top that says many good ideas weren't acted upon, is because it was sponsored by 13 federal agencies. It was very hard for any one agency to say, oh, this is directed at me, right? It didn't have that same kind of direction towards one or two federal agencies. Instead, it was the entire ecosystem should consider doing this. And I think that made it easier for agencies to not necessarily pick up and run with some of the recommendations that are pretty common sense. So I'll leave on that provocative note.
All right, so we're a little bit behind on time, and unfortunately, we really do have to end at a specific time. So we're going to ask that the next group kind of move forward and take their seats at the head of the table, the former OSB chairs. And for the rest of you, if you want to do a quick bio break, get some drinks real quick while that movement is happening, that would be great. But we'll make it quick.
And if you're on Zoom, you can turn the,
All right, everyone.
turn on the sound again.
Larry.
So, thank you. I had the privilege of chairing the Ocean Studies Board from 1996 to the year 2001. And the overall comment that I would make is that I feel incredibly grateful, appreciative of what a wonderful time I had to be there. I mean, you had a wonderful staff, which we've heard said before, but it deserves to be said again. Great board members. Raina was on that board, among others. But there were other stars that were aligned as well. I was very fortunate that Bob Gagosian at the Oceanographic was extremely supportive and loaned us people for congressional relations as we needed it. And we were very fortunate to have built an incredibly strong relationship with Admiral Watkins in Corps, so that for different purposes, we could reach out and have impact in ways that maybe wouldn't normally have. Trying to find a funny story. I'm not even sure it's funny, but it is a story. There's this report, which Raina will probably remember, Opportunities in Ocean Sciences. It came up because 1998 was the year of the ocean, and there were all sorts of activities being planned to celebrate the event, including an ocean conference in Monterey. So we thought the board ought to have some voice in the matter. So we created this short report that you could probably read in about 15 minutes that summarized some of the important problems in the ocean sciences and some of the payoffs if you pursued these things. Bob Gagosian found a way to brief President Clinton with this report using his various influences, but he also loaned us the services of Bill Andehazy, our congressional liaison person at Woods Hole. And Bill set up an opportunity for me to go over and brief people on the Hill. And Bill was very enthusiastic. And so he lined up approximately 14 briefings to do in about 6 hours or less. And so we got started on these things and went through the first 6 or 8 briefings, and it got to be lunchtime. I was supposed to brief somebody over lunch, and it became clear that I wasn't going to be able to have lunch and get to the next thing on time. So Bill says, okay, take it from here. And then Bill gave the entire briefing. So, which was great. I really appreciate that. And by the time I got to the last one, I was talking to Penny Dalton, who's a staffer over there who had a good sense of humor. And it's a good thing because I was getting giddy having given this talk 14 times in one day. So that's my story.
Just being here and seeing Ken and Dan and a bunch of other friends, Jen and obviously Sue is kind of a pleasure. When Sue approached me a few weeks ago, my first reaction was OSB. Wow, that was a long time ago. I don't know. And of course, I've been thinking about it ever since and trying to remember and remembering all the people. So thank you, Sue, for dredging up some good memories and maybe a little pain. And I noticed that in 20 years, right, we're the old codgers, we've been gone for 20 years. Some things have changed for the better, some things have changed for the worse. So all this virtual stuff is amazing. That's the fact that you figured out how to do that and made a committee work and came up with a report virtually, incredible. Some things maybe not so good. There's no coffee. There is no coffee to be had. I don't know what's happened to the National Academies, but if you can't get a cup of coffee, it's the beginning of the end. So thinking about my time as OSB director, what would be of interest? What would be worthwhile to share? And I had one kind of serious thought and one a bit lighter. And the serious thought I had, which has really been
emphasized listening today is the tension in the Ocean Studies Board, and it's true across the academy, between being a kind of lobbying group for science and being a service group to the government. And there were definitely times when there was conflict between those two things. Are we, the NRA? Are we big pharma? Are we just pushing our own interests? We want more money. We want more opportunity. We want more training, more schools, more students. Are we here advancing our interests? Or are we here to talk about how what we know can help the world, can help the country, can help advance issues? And of course, we heard that talking about all these old reports as well, that tension has been there for a long time, apparently still strong and true. And I was very sad, sorry, this is a little bit of a serious note, but to read recently about the serious conflict of interest issues that have come up in the academies about where we take money from. And that was always true back then too. Who's giving us the money, and does that allow us to be truly objective? Are we trying to please our sponsors, or are we really telling it like it is, even if we know that they won't like it? And I think because it is such a serious place and because it does so much worthwhile work, it behooves everyone involved even more to think about those issues, to think about whether we are serving ourselves, whether we are serving our sponsors, or whether we are serving truth, apple pie in the American way, with it really true to our scientific values. So that was my sort of more serious thought. But the other part, when someone asked me what was it like working at the academies, and I was just reminded it just now, Stacy came up to me, and apparently she had asked me before she came to work here what I thought about the place, which I'd forgotten our conversation. And I probably said to her what I always say to everybody. I've had a lot of jobs since. I've been on boards of different organizations. You are surrounded all the time by smart people. And in many areas of life, at many kinds of jobs, that is not true. You're when you're working here, the staff, the board members, the committee members, the whole organization, really, you are surrounded by really smart, well-meaning people who are trying to do the right thing, even if I don't always agree with them about what the right thing is. But it felt great that the however long I spent here, 10 years, it felt, and to this day, feels great to have been in an environment where it really mattered. It really mattered to be smart and mostly nice.
Well, first of all, let me just say, I remember this room being bigger.
Hey, Dan, can you remember? Yeah, the mic,
How
thanks.
about now?
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or maybe use Morgan's if it doesn't work.
There we
Ah,
go.
There we go.
Okay, what I was saying was, I remember this room being bigger. I don't go to high school reunion. I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't go to high school reunions. I don't go to family reunions. I'm like, what have I got to do next week, next month? That's just the way I operate. But when this came up, I could not say no. All right. So I'm very happy to be here and see many of you again. One of the things that I remember about the Academy, and of course, like everything else, it starts with Morgan. When we were here, we had and you probably still do. I mean, I haven't been affiliated with OSB for 15 years, but I can remember closed door discussions about which studies we were going to turn down because they did not fit our definition, the board's definition of our remit. And I think that says something. We were turning down studies because we didn't think they fit what we should be doing, or they weren't in the national interest, or they weren't in the scientific community's interest. I also remember looking across, because I had an opportunity to work with many other boards and board staffs. I think the strength of the Ocean Studies Board has always been the diversity of support we've received. if you work for some boards where you have one sponsor and you irritate that sponsor, you might be looking at layoffs. And I can remember that happening in some of the boards when we were around. But we enjoyed so much support from such a diverse set of federal agencies, state governments, nonprofits. We were in a position where we could have those kinds of discussions and really, really try to elevate our game. And I will always remember that. The other thing about that I remember working at the academies was it was probably the one place in my entire life where you could really argue with somebody and come away with mutual respect. I don't know how many of you have worked in a variety of environments, but if I was as free with my thoughts today as I was in some of these board meetings as staff and welcome to express my opinion, I'd be looking for a job. So I just, to me, the academy complex, I talk about the academy complex and the process. I'm working with the American Society of Civil Engineers now, and I'm trying to get them to adopt methods and mechanics that are similar to the function of the governing board of the academy, where somebody is really looking holistically about how all the different pieces fit together, what studies make sense, how they should be populated, the committees populated, how they should be reviewed. I just think the process here is just just second to none. But the one story I will share, and I don't know how many of you or when was the last time you guys met at Woods Hole, but we were at the Cottage House, and there was actually I think it was a Seeger meeting, the commission. This would have been before, what is it now? Before Dell's. Okay, so this is back in the day quite a bit. And so Morgan and I were having a spirited conversation outside of the building about, the role of the statement of work. Yeah, statement of work, whatever, and who should decide and what should be the priority. And like Morgan and I often have heated exchanges or with mutual respect, we just kept elevating and elevating and elevating. The volume got higher and higher and higher. They finally had to send a staff person out to where we were standing outside to tell us to shut up. But I enjoyed every single day that I worked at the Ocean Studies Board, working with Sue, with Ed Urban, with all of you, obviously. It was I worked at the White House, I worked at NOAA, I worked in private sector. None of those jobs all paled in comparison to the 11 years that I spent here. So I just hope everybody appreciates what we have.
Nancy, we didn't know if you would be able to join us. I'm so happy to see you. Can you hear us?
I didn't see her on the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't hear Nancy. Can you hear me?
I can't hear, but I'm reading the,
Oh, she must be looking at the subtext.
Okay.
can't hear, but I'm reading the captions.
It's your turn, Nancy.
Okay. I'm gonna help you catch up with time because of this. I have a broken bone in my eye orbit. And so I had a hard time even putting this slide together, but I began my working with the Ocean Studies Board in 1999, and I was part of the Oil in the Sea 4 that just finished up 2 years of incredibly hard work, and you will see the results of that. During that time, I finished up with Oil in the Sea 3, where Jim Coleman, a geologist from LSU, was the chair. And he asked me, "You want to be the chair of the Ocean Studies Board?" And I said, "Me? I can't possibly do that." But lo and behold, I did. I did not get called out for the swimming pool incident, but that's okay. You can find out about that from others at the meeting. And then the Water Science Technology Board found me.
and I did a lot of Mississippi River work. And while I was chair, I think Richard Alley gave a Roger Revelle commemorative lecture, and I said, I could do something like that. And then in 2011, I was asked to do something like that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know how to do that. So I keep learning all the time. Second slide. I just wanted to show this picture if it hasn't shown up yet. This is what I call the power women. I was the first female to break through the glass as a chair of the Ocean Studies Board. The first one who came from a southern state, Louisiana, not a pedigree of the kinds that many people have to be chairs of the Ocean Studies Board. But I was ready to go. My first meeting, the discussion was going a little too long, and Morgan grabbed my gravel and started hitting the desk. I said, wait a minute, that's my gravel, because I have a different way of listening to people. But anyway, some really short tidbits. I've had a wonderful time being on the Ocean Studies Board, and it was my way to learn about all kinds of people in all walks of life. And I really thank you all. That's it for me.
Well, I gotta thank this panel, personally, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Morgan. She was the director of the Ocean Studies Board at the time, and I can still remember. I remember almost everything about coming in and interviewing with Morgan, and I remember it was amazing to me because I'd applied for a lot of jobs before. I'd gone on the academic job search. You do several days, you give a seminar, and then you don't hear anything for months. And I think Morgan called me maybe 2 days later and said, oh, well, if you want the job, it's yours. I was like, wow, this is cool. And then the other one, this was with Dan. I have to say, Jen hit it right on the nail. It was working with this crew that really, it kept me working at the academies. And so much great advice I got from Dan and Ed Irvin. And I think I told Morgan this once, that one of the best things about working for Morgan was that she treated us like professionals. And that just made the whole job worthwhile for me. I really felt like I was, respected and part of the team. And so I really appreciated her leadership. And I remember Dan asking me, I guess it was maybe like a couple of months after I'd started. And, we all go through this, you're drinking from the fire hose with all this new information and, a totally different way of working than you've ever even considered before. And Dan said, well, so how's it going? And I said, oh, I feel like I died and went to heaven. And it's because of what Morgan said, that you're working with these really, really smart people and who are really dedicated. And I found that, I've been at the academies for 25 years now, and that opinion hasn't changed in that 25 years. I've always really appreciated, the quality of the staff, at the Ocean Studies Board, at the academies, and the quality of the people who are volunteers. It's just amazing. It really makes this job, a privilege. So just wanted to thank you all. I know Ken Brink was the chair of the board when I first started, and I think it was really Ken's initiative that got, sort of that study that we're going to talk about soon. It was started out as the Ocean's Role in Human Health. The report's called From Monsoons to Microbes, but I think Ken was, certainly one of the people who helped us get that work in. It was before I even started at the academies. So thank you all. We're going to move on now, but you guys can stay where you are because I think you're on the agenda. So the next one is the 1992 report, Oceanography in the Next Decade, and Ken's going to talk about that. I can say that I think I remember now that when I started, Morgan gave me that report. That's like, okay, here's what you need to know about, the Ocean Studies Board. It's all in that report.
Thank you. I need to change tracks here quickly. The report in question came out in 1992 called Oceanography: The Next Decade. And it was a decadal report that was prepared by the board as a whole using input collected from the community outside. And it served the purpose of a lot of decadal reports. It was meant to describe the status of the community and its infrastructure. It was meant to point out priorities and directions for research, and frankly, to brag about accomplishments that had been taking place up to that time. The report, I think, is a major credit to Bill Merrill and to Arthur Noel. I mean, Arthur took a lot of energy, put it into questions of demographics, and he did a superb job pulling together that information, not without its blemishes, because the kind of information he was trying to gather is so hard to get. Before I go on, how many of you remember the last line in the movie Casablanca? Okay, that's relevant to what I'm going to be saying. There in some ways, two ways that's relevant. One is, okay, I should say what the line is, I suppose. The last line in Casablanca was, I think this is going to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And indeed this was in two levels. One was the report stressed partnerships, and specifically between the federal government and the academic institutions. It's a theme that comes up over and over again in the report. But just by absolutely dumb luck, about the time this report came out, Admiral Watkins, who had been Secretary of Energy and had chaired a committee on AIDS, an incredibly distinguished career coming up to that time, became the head of CORE, Consortium for Ocean Research and Education. So he came in and he was obviously looking for something to get a handle on. So he took this report and went through it with a pencil, and he marked it all up and came back and said, partnerships. We need to stress partnerships. And so one thing that came of that was the National Ocean Partnership Program, which is still ongoing. The twist that Admiral Watkins added to it was that he included the private sector. And to this day, the NOP program involves the private sector, academics, and the government agencies trying to stimulate new lines of research. And another piece of it that I don't know how effective it turned out to be was to put together an ocean research advisory panel that was supposed to help coordinate between institutions and agencies. And I think that went quiet probably fairly quickly. So that's why I brought in Casablanca, because that built ties between the board and Admiral Watkins right from the get-go. And after that, Admiral Watkins was very much our friend. He, at one point, not too long after that, he strongly encouraged me, and if you know Admiral Watkins, you know what that means, to get involved in the interaction between the state of the ocean and human health. And that went on to more that we'll hear about later. The other reason I like this report in particular comes back to what Arthur Noel did, looking at the demographics in the field. Coming up to that time, most of the people who were on the Ocean Studies Board had come of age at a time when the ocean sciences were extraordinarily prosperous. Money almost grew on trees. And well, but the catch was by 1990 or so, when this report was coming together, that wasn't true anymore. People couldn't figure out what was going sour. And the beauty of what Arthur did was he took a good hard look at the demographics, And to make a long story short, what he showed was that the population of practicing ocean scientists had more or less doubled in the last decade. But the dollars for federal basic research in the ocean sciences adjusted for inflation was about flat. And so this is, we finally understood, or at least I finally understood at that point, why the malaise, why we were having such a harder time. And to my knowledge, that study has something quite like that's never quite been done again, because the information is incredibly hard to pull together. You know, how many, not just how many people are in academics, but how many people are doing basic research in the ocean sciences, because that goes all over the place. And likewise, we tried for, Morgan, what was it, about another 15 years, I believe, to try to track the dollars going into basic research in the ocean. And finally, somebody whose name I won't repeat threw up his arms and said, "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to give you any more information." Because of the tracking that information, once you get outside NSF or ONR, becomes very difficult. Anyhow, so I think it was a huge contribution in terms of what the report laid out in terms of needs. I think some of those things are going to be more or less obvious to a lot of us. It reported on the science at the time. It made predictions about where the breakthroughs were going to be in the next decade. And you can look back at it and it's about what you'd expect, you know, where some things were well predicted, some things were overly optimistic, and some wonderful things were completely unanticipated. And it would be a sad field if we didn't have those unanticipated victories. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ken. The next one is the Global Ocean Observing System, Users, Benefits, and Priorities, and it's going to be Dan and Ken Brink. So don't go anywhere, Ken.
Ken, did we decide who was going to go first? I'm supposed to go first? Ken, you need better staff. I did not present or prepare any slides. So, sorry. This report, I think, was seminal for a variety of different reasons. First of all, it was my first study at the National Academies. I think it was first of about 20 studies I was involved with for one way or another. But it was also taking place at a time that was, I would say, not to use an overused pun, but it was a bit of a sea change. If you look at the Academy's reports, especially the Ocean Studies Board's reports leading up to this study, which was, I think must have started in '96. There's a couple things. One, this was the first study that I recall or that I see where we really began to look at more than just the impact of activities on ocean science and our understanding of ocean science. We brought in aspects that were focused on, you know, the utility of the data for other purposes. We looked at some of the economic impacts associated with ocean observing or what was planned as ocean observing at the time. The study was really driven by these major programs, which Raina and I will talk about a little bit later, where we were, you know, instrumenting the ocean at a very large scale, utilizing new technologies, doing synoptic measurements over huge geographies. But we were also looking at like, well, what's the other additional benefit to society of this data? And so it took us in a direction that I think was a bit different and that we've replicated many times since then. Even listening to the briefings of the studies that have been done in the last few years, you still see the importance of ocean observing. I think I'll leave it to Ken to talk about the broader implications of this for ocean science, but the idea of coupling, taking federally procured data, using it for multiple purposes, thinking about the cost benefit analysis associated with that, and then you look forward to commercialization of data, all of the issues that we're still talking about today. You know, even in today's NOAA, Rick Spinrad, who's been part of this discussion going all the way back, he was with Admiral Watkins at CORE back at the beginning. You know, we're still talking about this. How do we bring greater value to society with this information? I work with civil engineers today, and I'm telling you, this notion of using ocean observational data, especially in the coastal zone, is really important. I think we have to think about it more in terms of how other communities use the data instead of just how it informs the science, which is certainly first and foremost. But all of those issues are threaded through this report in this study. The other thing that I noticed that I mentioned to Ken, which, you know, I think is not inconsequential. I was not around when the committee was formed. I inherited the committee. I mean, it was a great committee, but it was the last all-male committee that I remember being at the Ocean Studies Board. And think about that. I mean, that really wasn't that long ago. So, you know, I think it was a seminal study in a lot of different ways, and Ken can talk more about it in terms of the implications for science.
Uh-oh. Okay, just as a bit of context, at the time this report was commissioned, the decision had been made that there would be a global ocean observing system, and that the motivation was coming mainly from the climate change community. They wanted to know, to put together a base of observations that could serve climate. But this report went into a good deal of specifics about other uses for sustained ocean observations. It envisioned an international entity, global ocean observing system, that would include a set of primarily physical measurements. But as you go through the report, there were sections on, gee, the system could include coastal measurements. The system could include, I believe, ocean acidification. And there were a lot of non-physical things that were discussed along the way. I think the report was a real success in the sense that it looked forward to the ocean observing system that we have today. And I think that in the broad outlines, that system looks a lot like what you would have expected reading this document. There are routine physical measurements being made in the ocean now, coupled to model systems, so that you can get on your computer right now and look up the state of the ocean in your favorite place in the ocean. We're taking advantage of these coupled models and observations. There's some programs part of Goose now that were largely unanticipated at the time we did this report, like the Argo program, which takes advantages of these wonderful vehicles that float around at 2,000 meters depth and occasionally come up and take measurements of temperature and salinity, and then they broadcast them to a satellite and you come back down, so you get velocity measurements. And it's got a huge international contribution involved in it. I believe right now there are something like 3,800 of these things out floating around the ocean. And the beauty of it is that a smaller country with an interest in the ocean can still contribute. They might only put out 5 of these floats or something like that, but it's scalable. And sure, the United States is the biggest contributor, but everybody can get involved. And I couldn't even tell you how many nations are involved in it. That's a great program. One thing that didn't turn out quite the way we would have expected when we wrote that report was the coastal aspects of Goose. There is not a coastal Goose that I'm aware of, but we have the international or the Integrated Ocean Observing System, which is a collection of regional programs with names like NERACOOS, where you're looking at around the coast of New England. And these things will involve routine measurements coupled to models, very much tied not so much to climate as to the needs of the local community. So, for example, near Portland, Maine, there's a buoy that's out there basically to tell fishermen, the fishing community, whether it's foggy out there or not, because otherwise it's hard for them to gather that information. Very needs oriented, at the same time providing sustained time series that are going to be valuable to the scientific community. So I think this has come to a happy ending. We could always use more and better. But at the time we wrote that report, I think if we could look at what we have now, we'd be very happy. we might not have been happy with how long it took to get there. But I think it really turned out to be a success.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure again to
Thank you.
draw Rena back onto the stage.
Okay,
and,
so
with Dan.
2 years after Dan notes there are no women on the committee, he gets me as chair for Global Ocean Science. And I think the way we're going to do this, Dan, is you go first and say whatever's on your mind.
All right, thanks, Raina. It was a real pleasure working with Raina. I learned a lot about how to choose hotel properties. I do remember that. Because Raina has very high standards in every aspect of these studies. So it was a real pleasure to work with her. I think the one thing about this study was, if I recall correctly, I think part of the controversy at the time, ocean science, and just as it is now, was still driven by the vision and the leadership of some rather large institutions. And those institutions were very important in terms of advocating for certain subdisciplines of the science. And so I think one of the questions that came up was ocean science at that time, a large portion of the funding was driven by large scale, community-wide major ocean programs that large groups of people and large numbers of institutions participated in. And I think there was a little bit of it created a dynamic tension between these very large scale, community-driven, high priority major ocean programs and smaller scale, individual scientists, kind of more, maybe provocative or innovative ideas and proposals. So that was kind of the backdrop behind what we were doing. We wanted to look at what the successes were, what the contributions were, whether or not there was an appropriate balance of funding and opportunity, so that the large programs weren't crowding out other concepts or other scientific endeavors, including, like use-inspired science. So we enjoyed very good sponsorship. I know NSF was involved, ONR, NASA, I believe. So we had a great committee. It was a great study. We got going and got a lot of good work in. But I think it was this idea of what's healthy for the community and how do these programs fit into that. So Raina, go ahead. And
thank you. I think you perfectly set the stage. And with the next, we see who the committee members were. They were terrific. Ken was the chair of the OSB back then. And again, this was done on Morgan's watch. So thank you. The statement of task was basically to look at these major ocean programs and examine their role in ocean research and a variety of other things. And I'll skip right to the origins. Really, I think it was, in a way, a gutsy thing for the NSF in particular to go ahead and sponsor this report, because they were asking the Academy to take a close look at the way we're funding things. Too much core, too much major ocean programs. And there was a feeling amongst a lot of people, including their committee of visitors, that maybe there's too much emphasis on these big programs. But on the other hand, the science that was evolving was looking at longer space scales, longer time scales, and it needed the efforts of more than the individual scientists. I'll also point out that the 1992 report, Oceanography in the Next Decade, suggested that advice be provided on how these major ocean programs should fit into the overall research strategy of our country. And then this idea that the major ocean programs, some of them were sunsetting. Well, how do you sunset them? Should they be sunsetted? Should they morph into something else? That was all part of what we were being asked to look at here. If I can have the next one. And the major recommendations that came out had to do with data sets. Gee, these data sets are more important they're more important to the whole community, and it's the legacy they leave. So we have to be really careful to give them over in a way that's comprehensive. There should be a thorough review of other facilities. Gee, I think I talked about that earlier today. Coordination across agencies. Did I talk about that today? A broad spectrum of interdisciplinary and research activities, no kidding. And well-defined procedures for initiating, selecting future major ocean programs. No one structure should fit every program, and there should be coordination amongst the major programs. The impacts, really, there were a lot of breakthroughs. The breakthroughs came in terms of science from the major ocean programs. They came in terms of facility, and they came in terms of technology. The discoveries, again, that, do I need the next slide? Thank you. The idea that these discoveries, the data, and the facilities will continue to be used. They're still being used. And I should say, as a disclosure here, I am a child of the major ocean programs. I grew up with GeoSex, and I'm ending my career with GeoTraces and GoShip. Okay, that's my confession. Impacts or influences. It's essential that these data sets be preserved, no kidding. That there be planning, and the planning involves sharing amongst the different programs. For example, we recently, 5 years ago, had a cruise in the Arctic that was both GoShip and GeoTraces together. Developing mechanisms for contingencies. This has come a long way. Modeling, come a long way. We used to have the token modeler on the steering committee. Okay, we've changed things, thank heavens. The interdisciplinary, again, I'll give a shout out to the Ocean Shot, and this idea of tracking key metrics, all kinds of metrics. How many new PIs are here? What kind of postdoc PI turnover is there? How many postdoc students looking at things like that? And the next slide, which is my last one, continuing challenges. The next slide, please. Thank you. This review of facilities is in the critical infrastructure that we talked about. Having well-defined milestones, including a clear end for these programs, establishing priorities for moving the long time series into an operational mode, whatever the hell that is. Continuing challenges, and I thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rena and Dan. I know that we're still talking about those programs now. And we had a lot of discussion about Globek on the first day of the meeting during our fisheries subcommittee meeting. So it was a really, important review to undertake. Thank you. Okay, we're coming up towards the end. And in 1999, the Academy has published the report From Monsoons to Microbes, Understanding the Ocean's Role in Human Health. And this was the study that Morgan brought me in to work on. So it was my first report. I'll tell you one interesting little factoid is that back in the day when the National Academy of Press didn't make the reports freely available for download as PDFs, we used to sell reports. Some people may remember those days. And I think Ken probably remembers this, can help with this story. But this was, it was my first report, and it was a report that was for retail sale by the National Academy of Press, which was very unusual for the Ocean Studies Board. And I think it was Ken who told me he actually saw a copy of it for sale in a Borders bookstore.
Sounds quite possible.
So I never had that happen to me again. So this was it. But Shirley Pomponi, I think you're on the line, and she's going to talk about the report. And then Rita Caldwell is here. And of course, she's probably the person we think of most when we think about the ocean's role in human health. She was really just such a pioneer in this whole issue. So Shirley, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. And we do have some slides. Are they? Oh,
Yep,
you got them.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Go, Shirley.
Well, same as Sue, this was my very first study as well. And I think I'm kind of echoing what Nancy Rabelais said earlier. It's like when I got the phone call, it's like, would you be interested in serving on this committee? I'm like, why me? But it was my very first study, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And let's go to the next slide. I think so. This was sponsored by NOAA, NASA, and NIHS. And I'm not sure, we had a workshop from, did we? It's so long ago, so I hardly even remember. But we actually met as a committee several times as well. I know you have here June 8th to 10th was a workshop. Okay, let's go to the next slide because it's been a long day. Okay, and so we had, again, a committee of experts, Bill Fennicle, who at the time he was the chair of the study, but I think he's retired now from Scripps, but very well-known marine natural products chemist. So it was, and same thing with Dan Baden. Now, Dan was working on marine natural products, but more in terms of like harmful algal blooms, things like that. But we had a broad diversity of committee members who had expertise in both the harmful aspects of oceans and human health and the beneficial aspects of oceans and human health. And one of the things, let's go to the next slide. One of the things I really liked about this study was that it was very well balanced. So we weren't just dealing with harm, like hazards, the negative aspects of the oceans and human health. And I'll tell you, just until recently, it's mostly been whenever we think about oceans and human health, we think about diseases and harmful algal blooms, hazards to public health, and that the beneficial aspects of the oceans in relation to human health has kind of gotten the kind of short end of this whole emphasis on oceans and human health for such a long time. Having said that, I will say that NIEHS and there have been some joint programs between NSF and NIEHS, and also NOAA as well, that have embodied both of those aspects. But it's really only been more recently, I think, where there's been a much larger emphasis on what's what's now called the blue economy. What are some of the bioproducts, the things that we can get from the ocean that can contribute to our economy, to our health, and so on. When you think about just pharmaceuticals, marine-derived pharmaceuticals, it's a multi-billion-dollar annual enterprise. So it's not insignificant in terms of what the ocean provides in terms of bioproducts, and not only drugs, but also other products that are being used now for regenerative medicine, even things that are like bioinspiration for architecture of skyscrapers and things like that. So it's really expanded. I would say that probably the European Union has really taken hold of this and has provided significant amounts of funding for the blue economy, marine biotechnology. And so the report was, but I thought our report was really very well balanced between the positives and the negatives, you know, the hazards and the benefits. And basically what we concluded were that we needed more information resources to improve prediction and prevention of public health disasters that were marine related, new technological approaches to help reduce risks to human health, and then contributions of marine organisms to medicine and research. So those were the major recommendations, and it really led the way for some significant amounts of funding, specifically focused on things like harmful algal blooms, I would say. And I think I'll just pass this on to Dr. Colwell now, who has, I think, probably more substantive comments to make about impacts of like climate change and things like that. So, Rita?
This working? Can you hear me? Good, good, good. I'd just like to make a comment, first of all, that I got home last night from 3 weeks in in Dubrovnik and Trieste and Naples. So the fact that I have not fallen asleep means that this has been a very interesting day. And the other comment is that just 2 days ago, I was looking at a recovered vessel at Pompeii 2,000 years ago, fisherman's boat. So we've been on the ocean for a long, long time as human beings. I thought what I would do is take the report's predictions and show how it's played out. So I'm going to give you some today's data showing that what we said we should do 20 years ago, it's almost 25 years ago, this report, we have been doing and finding out what we had predicted. First of all, the oceans have been, obviously, we think of human health, fisheries, recreation, source of energy, etc., with the specter, of course, of climate change. But to address the microorganisms, the time of this report, 1998, 99, microbiology, in terms of genomics, was just beginning to explode. And so understanding microorganisms in the ocean really was more predictive, and it has certainly proven to be very prescient, this report. The focus of the report in terms of the microbiology was on the bacteria, the viruses, fungi, the protists, the algae, etc. But what I think was critical in bringing together a systems approach is that we've been talking all day about a changing ocean, acidification, CO2, etc. What we did know 25 years ago was that the common microorganism, easy to culture, was Vibrio species. What we, as a general community, don't understand, or because we're not microbiologists, most of you are not microbiologists, is that the causative agent of a major pandemic, which we have been under for the last 2 or 3 decades, along with COVID, is the cholera epidemic. And Vibrio cholerae is a marine bacterium. It requires sodium for structure to function. But it's also part of a large number of species of Vibrios that carry out carbon and nitrogen cycling. And so they're important. They can't be eradicated. But what happens is when you alter the ocean, then they become abundant and then create a human health problem. So if I could have the next slide. More than 50% of the global human population lives within 50 miles of the coast. So we, as humans, are directly affected by the quality of the oceans and the coastal regions. Now, the intersection of climate change and ocean microbiology, we were just beginning to understand the drivers, the environmental drivers, for example, of the cholera epidemic. Temperature, salinity, all these factors that are really ocean driven drive the pandemic of cholera. But in the last 20 years, we also have been having the problems of other species of Vibrios turning out to be pathogens. Vibrio parahemolyticus, fancy name for a bacterium that's associated with seafood and is the #1 cause of food poisoning or gastroenteritis in Japan. And as I'll show in a moment, has now become a major problem in the United States. There's another bacterium, Vibrio vulnificus, which isn't a pandemic, but if you get infected with it, fatality rate is 50%. So it's a killer. And it's now a current problem in Florida. So let me take the next slide. What I'm describe very briefly here is how international oceanography has come up with some very interesting results. About 7 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, a group in Italy, in Genoa, Dr. Carla Pruzzo and her team, the Max Planck team, working in DNA work, and the Plymouth and the Southampton Marine Laboratories, and our team in Maryland joined up, and we took advantage of the fact that the marine labs had been doing what we call citizen science. They had been collecting plankton samples for 40 years. So there were in the Plymouth and the Southampton laboratories, plankton samples, which together as a team, we extracted the DNA and from the specific areas in the North Sea and off the coast of the northern US. Next slide. We were able to show that over that 40-year period, with that very gradual increase in sea surface temperature, there was a concomitant increase in the numbers of these Vibrio species. We have the next slide. And we matched it up with the increasing number of infections reported for these Vibrio infections, seafood poisoning, vulnificus illnesses, deaths, and occasionally even in the countries of Western Europe, occasionally some cholera outbreaks. We have the next slide. Now, what we are finding today is that when we look at the data going all the way back to 1988 to the present, we find that there is an increasing number of infections with Vibrio vulnificus, with occasional deaths in the Chesapeake Bay. And next slide. Especially in Florida, right after the Hurricane Ian, a whole series of these infections began to appear. We have the next slide. And so we now see on the left the trend for vibriosis. That means any kind of Vibrio infection. And remember these are marine bacteria. These are exposures to individuals, either fishermen, recreational individuals, those who are sailing, whatever. And then on the right are the number of cases of Vibrio vulnificus And this has been going up to the point where currently there is a crisis in some parts of Florida with Vibrio vulnificus infections. So what we are now living with is the actual fact that the coupling of climate change and the effect on a residual autochthonous native living marine bacteria is now causing a direct human public health effect. So I think the report, which by the way was delightfully, now I understand why it's in a book. It's really neat. It's a nice little book, and it's quite prescient in terms of the predictions or the recommendations of what needs to be done. So as a result, I think of this intersection of climate change, ocean microbiology, and human health, I think we see that in the next decade or two, there are going to be some pretty dramatic effects with respect to human health. So there's a sense of urgency here. But at the same time, and I'd also like to point out that the report recommended that a systems approach be taken, and from what was just said by Dr. Pompone, that we can look to new kinds of approaches to study the oceans. And in fact, one of them is satellite sensing, because now coupling satellite sensing with computational modeling, we can actually predict the risk of pandemics such as cholera and other vector-borne disease-driven pandemics. And so in a sense, this very early work on satellite sensing, computational modeling has really contributed a new public health tool. So this report, I think, is one that says a lot, predicts a lot, and the predictions, I think, have been proven out. So with that, I would just like to say that this, I think, is a demonstration of where a National Academy report can make a very huge difference and can provide guidance for where the directions of research should go. I was not a participant in the report because 1998, I was appointed director of NSF. It would have been highly inappropriate for me to be serving on an academy committee and funding at the same time. And I do vaguely remember that one of the reasons that NSF funding was not given to the report was because I was director, and it would have looked as though I was funding my own research interest. So that's my story. And I've also given you some extra time.
Well, thank you so much, both to Shirley and to Rita for giving us that overview of that report. I was this is as much a question, I think, for our audience as a statement, but I know that after the report came out, there was those new programs that were authorized by Congress, one at NOAA and then the NSF NIEHS program. And I guess my impression had been that the report had influenced the development of those programs. Do you have any insight on that, Rita?
Yes. In fact, there is a report, Ecology of Emerging Infectious Diseases, that Elis Zahuni and I put together to get NIH and NSF to work together, because NIH would never fund fundamental ocean ecology, and NSF wasn't going to be funding any medical research because NIH's budget was like 10 times bigger. So by having that joint report, which now continues to this day and is very effective, that came out of this report. At the same time, a partnership between NSF and NIH that emerged that continues to fund the kind of research I've just been describing.
Yeah, Larry?
Just had a quick question. So does the Academy track legislation that comes directly from reports? That would be a very powerful
I would say
statistic.
not very well. So I think, if certainly if I see something, it's, I will track it for sure. And there have been, I think, some really remarkable examples that we haven't talked about today. And that was from several of the fisheries studies in particular, where I can think of one. It was the first report that we did on the recreational fisheries survey system. And the next reauthorization of the Magnuson Act, it actually told NOAA to implement the recommendations in that report. So it doesn't get more direct than that, I think, in terms of sort of an influential program. But yeah, I think it's a challenge for us, for sure. We do hear about any requests for studies, but I think it's just as important for us to know when our studies are having impact in Congress. Yeah. Oh, one thing I will say, I do look to, this whole community to let me know about impacts as well, because, you're part of my ears on the ground to hear about, something, if you know that the reports had an influence, to let us know. And then we can, that improves our tracking.
There's the coastal ocean mapping one had 9 of the 11 recommendations were turned into authorizations, into law. So that,
Yeah, I did, so there are a lot of reports that didn't make it on this list, and this was not a scientific exercise by any stretch of the imagination. So there are, certainly, quite a few reports that I would say would get honorable mention, and that would be one of them. I think the coastal mapping report was one. The other one actually was one that Morgan did. Is Morgan still here? Oh, there she is. Yeah, on marine biodiversity. And Jesse Osobel sent me a note and said how important that report was to the development of the Census of Marine Life. So that was, that's a huge impact, I think, for our community. So there, I could go on with other examples. There was one tiny little report, actually, and it's all because of Dan Walker. We had this small study that was funded by EPA to look at mitigating erosion on sheltered coast. That's what it was. And we had, it had a tiny little budget. And so Dan came to me one day and he said, I'm too expensive. We don't have enough money for this. So you're going to have to do it. That was, it was like my second year, maybe as chair, I'd been a chair for a year and a half. I'm like, oh my gosh, But I knew nothing about that issue at all. But I learned so much about, the whole issue of eroding, coastlines and sort of the influence of sea level rise and the incredible impact that would have on communities. And I've briefed that report more times than any other study I ever did for the academies. It's really kind of amazing. And one of the impacts of that report is it's in the Federal Register, because one of the things that the report said was that we aren't very good at doing cumulative impacts. And there's some unintended consequences to the way we permit, shoreline hardening. So basically you can there is a national permit for shoreline hardening, so that, building a seawall, for example, or a revetment, but there was nothing for a living shoreline. So for anybody who was interested in putting in a living shoreline, they had to go through so many more hoops to try to get a permit to do that, because there was no nationwide permit. And so one of the things that happened was after the report came out, was that the Corps put in for a nationwide permit for living shorelines to make it easier for people to do it. And they referenced that report. So, that's another example where you wouldn't see it we've provided a lot of the metrics for the reports that we get from National Academy Press, which is, how many people download it and that type of thing, and how many citations, but you would never see an impact like this Federal Register notice that made it, sort of possible for homeowners now to put in living shorelines. Rita?
You recommend that there be an update of this not an update, but there would be the next stage of this report because, for example, I think what would be incredibly useful would be a study on the ocean microbiome. It seems to me that the way genomics, it's been mentioned, I think today others have mentioned the fact that ocean genomics, microorganisms of the ocean are beginning to be understood. I think, John, you pointed out in oil degradation is a major driver by microorganisms. So it seems to me a stage 2 or a next generation report would be an awfully powerful document for the Ocean Studies Board.
Well, sign me up, Rita. Yeah, the other thing I have to confess is I started my career as a marine microbiologist, so it was just so much fun to get to work on that. So Rita was one of my early heroes. So I would like to make, if anybody else would like to sort of mention a report or, an activity.
I'm not going to mention a report so much, but listening to this just occurs to me how, first of all, I'm remembering how many of these reports for some reason over my life I was interested in and looking forward to, or knew where the origins were, or knew somebody who participated in. So it really is nice to remember and also maybe track how impact might be amplified if we did a better job about thinking about this as an ongoing basis. But it does seem to me it might be worth some discussion of the Ocean Studies Board itself, not to give us more work, but to really look at those ones that did have impact, and maybe the metrics for impact might be the conditions under which they have impact might be something that actually starts to reveal itself when you look at it. The sheltered shorelines, I know where that came out of. There was a very specific need, and we knew there was an audience for that report to some extent. Certainly the CDR seems to be I'm going to guess that the community knew that this was an issue that was coming up of great significance. So let's get this out on the street in some regard. And it was interesting that was a foundation funding one, because they often are more sensitive to the political environment sometimes than the federal agencies are. I mean, they're the outside broader political environment. So it might be interesting to think at some point about this impact question a little bit and have a little bit of a thought of under what the conditions under which are that have these impacts that might be more than the traditional NAS measures of impact. So anyway, just a thought, because just very exciting to hear remember all of these things. And I'm sure you all have many more examples that I was not participating in. So it's cool. Thanks.
Yeah, anyone outside? And I know we do have people, in online. And so certainly if you give an opportunity to people who are listening in remotely as well, if you can raise your hand, I think. Okay, I guess we saturated our audience for the day.
Yeah, so they're coming at 4:10.
Yeah, so I can give you guys a break, but we do have a really, I think, exciting event actually 2 exciting events to end the day. For this particular session, it's the new art installation, Blue Dreams, which is part of the Ocean Memory Project. And that came out of another Academy's activity, the Deep Blue Sea workshop. And they have an installation at the Academies now, so you can go and see it. It's not very far away. It's on the 2nd floor. If you go out to where the entrance to the auditorium is, you'll see some stairs, and you just go up the stairs and the installation is right there. You can't miss it. And I did notice as you walk out that way, there is another installation on the wall of some of the artwork of our next guest, who's Rebecca Ritzstein. And so they're going to come and talk about the installation. And after that, we're going to have a small reception. And so I'm going to, invite everyone to, walk around, have some food. If you're in this room, we're going to show the old photos, so you can see that. Photo. Oh, and yes, thank you. And we want a photo for today too. So we'll see if we can get everyone together. I don't know how you want to do this, Claudia.
Yes, we're having a photo. And I think it would be lovely after we talk about the art, before we kind of go into the reception and prep for the Ravel lecture, if we could all very briefly gather for a photo. I mean, this is truly a momentous event that we're having here. I think, you know, it's so exciting to sit here and think about all the studies and the outcomes and the tremendous impacts that they have in our field. Everything from Argo to satellites, you know, to data, and to really think about how just yesterday we're still talking about data and accessibility and, you know, equity and justice, and how all of these aspects that we are still working on can be communicated more broadly across our field and beyond. So yes, I would very much like a photo. And so if we could plan on doing that right at 4:30, kind of at the official end of our day of activities, that would be great. So in the meantime, we will see everyone back here 10 minutes, you know, to refresh in here. The photo, well, this is what I was going to ask Sue, because I'm not as familiar with where the best photo taking place will be, but I will be sure to inform you in just a few moments.
Yes,
So
so you,
Katie,
yes,
I know.
yeah, so we'll have to have John provide the poems.
I think that's what he's aiming.
Okay, everyone, if you can take your seats again, and those of you who are online, if you can, come back to your computer and put in your earbuds again. We're so pleased today to have the artist who is behind this amazing installation that we have the opportunity to see today for the Ocean Memory Project called Blue Dreams, and that's Rebecca Rootstein. Is that, can you pronounce it correctly or close enough? Okay, cool. And then Tom Skalak is okay. Co-creator of Blue Dreams and the senior advisor to the founders of the Joe and Clara Tsai Foundation. And then the Academy's own JD Talasek, who's the director of cultural programs. And so JD does so much of the work of organizing these exhibits that we get to enjoy at the National Academies, these art exhibits. So JD, are you going to do the honors? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here with Tom and Rebecca and to share a few ideas with you. I don't want to assume anything. Everybody here knows Jody Deming and the Ocean Memory Project. Jody Deming, at least. So maybe we need to talk a
so
little.
we did have a very brief introduction to the Ocean Memory Project. And so I think most of the people in the room know at least a little bit about it, but maybe not a lot.
So Jody, who is one of your colleagues, a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a personal hero of all of ours, had the idea of creating a project that brought in people from different disciplines, including science and art, to explore the question of, can the ocean be thought of as having a memory? And this was this project was supported by the National Academy's Keck Futures Initiative in the last iteration of that. And so what has happened is there's been many different people who have done different projects, and the Blue Dreams Project is part of that. And part of that Blue Dream team is Tom and Rebecca, who are joining me today. So I'd like to just kind of jump in with both of you as to what is Blue Dreams. What is the installation? We're seeing some stills and some installations, and I will say that when we're done here, we'll invite you to go up to the gallery and experience the immersive video firsthand. But tell us a little bit more about Blue Dreams, how it got started, and what the idea was behind it, Rebecca. And if you,
Hi, that was loud. Thanks for having me. It's really an honor to be here. As an artist, I'm really interested in connecting people and the public with the natural world. And I've been working with oceanographers for several years, going out on research vessels and really trying to sort of synthesize the information and the exploration that we're doing. And becoming part of the Ocean Memory Project was absolutely life-changing for me in terms of thinking about and working together with scientists and artists, collectively thinking and sort of coming up with the concept together versus the artists and the scientists working separately and the artists coming in to communicate a scientific idea. And so this was actually I'm sorry, I'm first talking about the Ocean Memory Project, but it was really a synthesis of artists and scientists and people in the humanities working together to look at the ocean through a different lens and to think about sort of the ocean and its inhabitants as an interconnected system that has agency and memory. And so through this project, I really started thinking about, not only the ocean in a different way, but my relationship with the natural world and how everything is connected. And so this particular project came out of one of the workshops through the Ocean Memory Project on cognition and genomics. And after the workshops, there would be an opportunity to apply for a small seed grant for a creative project or a written piece. And so we started thinking about, a few of us from that workshop started thinking about the resilience and the resiliency of microbial networks in the deep ocean. And this piece kind of sprang from that. And I'll let you take over more.
Well, as you can tell, for a scientist, it's extremely freeing to work with an artist like Rebecca, because the artist's temperament is not just to observe the world and collect data and analyze, but to reinvent, actually. And as you can see by the images, I think this was a work of abstract art that eventually emerged from the kind of synergy in our co-creative group. And that was really a pleasure. I think many of you can probably relate to the idea of being free again, because that's why a lot of us got into the field of science in the first place, right? Out of curiosity and kind of the wonder of discovering new things. And that was very palpable as this group began to interact. And, the second aspect of it was, out of the workshop, I think Rebecca and I really connected originally because we wanted to do something, we said originally, at a monumental scale, something that could inspire awe and a sense of the sublime in people. And of course, everyone in this room, having studied the oceans, probably feels that awe and wonder at the side of the ocean or on the ocean or deep under the ocean. And so that was an element of why it eventually was realized in this form. And I have to say, JD's support of it and the Academy's support of it was central to get it executed at the scale that you'll see upstairs and in the upstairs gallery. So, those are some of the things that were attractive, I think, to the whole team about creating this work. And we're happy that it ended up at this scale. And our hope is that it may be able to travel beyond scholars of the ocean to reach a much, much wider public audience and perhaps be exhibited in other cities and museums around the world after it leaves here.
So just back up and let's just kind of talk specifically about what it is. What is this installation that's upstairs? This is an immersive video experience. It's a projection that you'll see in person. The Schmidt Ocean Institute helped provide funds for us to buy the equipment and to set this up. Much thanks to the team for helping us secure those funds. But the ideal is to create an experience, something that's not necessarily traditionally thought of as science communication, but something to experience. And Nancy Knowlton, who's done so much work with the arts at the Museum of Natural History, knows that what this does that traditional exhibits can't do is that it instills a sense of awe and wonder, and we hope curiosity, at least enough curiosity to encourage somebody to ask questions and want to learn more. So it's not just your traditional science communication. It is a form of engagement that hopefully will run a little bit deeper.
I would just add to that along those lines, again, we're trying, when I'm creating art in general. And I've done work outside of, this is the first time I've actually done a video installation. I do painting and sculptural installations. I've worked with light to sort of mimic bioluminescent communication in the deep sea. So this is a different type of project for me, but I think in all of those instances, I'm interested in, again, creating awe and wonder, but also as a means to create empathy. And I think through empathy and through people getting out of their silos of their discipline and sort of coming together, we can really face the climate crisis that we have. And so that's sort of really the driving force in my work. And, you know, there's a lot of things to be really depressed about when we think about, you know, all of the problems that we have in terms of ocean acidification, you know, warming waters, all of it. I'm interested in sort of touching on the positive, touching on the sublime, thinking about, you know, this piece in particular really talks about sort of how microbes proliferate. We actually work with computer modeling of a painting I created to sort of show and simulate how microbes can grow. Thinking specifically, this piece is specifically working with footage from Pescadero Basin in the Gulf of California, and thinking about the Beggiatoa microbial mats there.
You know, Rebecca, you've gone to so many artist residencies at sea. In fact, she just came here from Woods Hole for a meeting that was up there. So she's very active with scientist communities, and to actually be on the research vessels. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about that. But I also want to kind of talk about sort of these residencies that are coming up in science field stations on marine labs. They're becoming a lot more commonplace. And I know one story about the Sage Hen Field Station in Northern California. It came about as a report from the Academy on the sustainability of marine labs and field stations. And in that book, in the report, there's a chart that simply says, you know, these stations and labs are doing a great job of collecting science. They're doing a great job of interpreting science. But where it's falling down is they're doing a poor job in creating empathy around the science that connects to the public, that then impacts policy. So I know that the curators or the scientists at Sage Hen, they worked with the local museum to bring in and start an artist residency program that's not unlike the Artists at Sea program that Schmidt has. So you can kind of see that it's starting. The idea is to help sort of connect with the public. But what happens when you have the artists working alongside the scientists? And I think this is a part that I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about, the sort of the synergy of how it helps, you know, the scientists doing the research think differently to have an informed, interested person asking questions at that point of doing the research. I think that's an interesting area.
Yeah, I can't speak more to this idea of the synergy. There really is a synergy that happens, especially, you know, I've worked with scientists in labs, but then I've also worked on research vessels, as JD mentioned, and being in the lab together, you know, kind of working side by side and creating together it's really changing and transformative for not just me, you know, who's inspired by their research, but the scientists are actually inspired by the artists, and they start. And I've heard time and time again, I think differently about my samples. I think differently about my research. I'm seeing things in a different way. I've actually been really fortunate to go down in Alvin twice, and I was down with one of my collaborators, and she was really busy. She had, you know, her list of samples she needed to deploy, and you know, her list of items, her tasks, and I was just looking around and noticing things that she didn't see, and she was just, you know, so happy that I was there, and there was this exchange of information and so it's not just one-sided. Speaking of Jody, you know, I just wanted to say something. Jody's been amazing. We've been working together since 2017 through the Ocean Memory Project, and she is a really good example of how I think scientists and artists are actually much more connected and have a lot more in common than are different. And I think scientists and artists are both creators. They are trying to understand the world around them. They're curious and they are observers. And Jody, I remember one of the first times I met her, she said, I became a scientist because I didn't feel like I could be creative as a pianist. She was a musician. She was a really accomplished pianist. And she said, I didn't feel like I could be creative because I was playing other people's songs, but as a scientist, I could create my own experiments and sort of be the driver of my research. Anyway, so that's just an aside, but there is a real synergy that happens when people get out of their silos. And I think that's the direction that we need to go. And a lot of these research vessels are now hosting artists. In fact, the new Fall Corps, so Schmidt Ocean Institute, they have a new vessel, the Fall Corps 2. I was one of the first artists that went on their ship in 2016, the original Fall Corps, but in their new Fall Corps, which is much bigger, they actually have a dedicated artist studio on the ship. And, I usually go with scientists through NSF grants in the broader impacts section, where, we're, as an artist or a writer or a, photojournalist, we are creating an outreach component. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm also interested in is this, we're very familiar with thinking about outreach and engaging with artists at the very end of the research when you're trying to connect it with the public. But what is suggested here with the artist residencies programs is that artists are coming into the conversation sooner. It's not meant to jeopardize or compromise scientific rigor, but rather to augment the experience and to bring in a different perspective, maybe a different way of looking. I know this is exactly what happened to Jody. I was in the room when they were having the steering committee. I'm telling on her a little bit. I don't think she would mind, but she was on the steering committee for the National Academy's Keck Futures Initiative, exploring the deep blue sea. And she would literally say, when we brought in artists and designers, she would sit back and she said, I like artists, but I don't know how this is going to work. It's just not going to work. And she'd have her arms folded higher on her chest and she could just see the barriers. But as we went forward and as she got to establish rapport with artists and they started having a conversation, it was an artist who, upon listening to her work, actually asked her, is it possible to think about the ocean as having a memory? And that was transformative. She leapt out of her chair and she took him by the shoulder and said, I've been looking for this type of way of speaking about my work for many years. And that's actually what led to the Ocean Memory Project. And I think she would admit that this has been transformative in the way that she is going about thinking about her work, more specifically the way that she's talking about her work and communicating about her work. So, Sue, how much time do we have? Are we running over or?
You're just at the end.
Okay.
At the time that we had on our agenda.
Okay. So
but do you have more? Did you have more to talk about, or?
No, I think what we wanted to do was invite people to come up when it's appropriate time. So
this is exactly what we thought. So we thought we would adjourn the meeting now and then have the opportunity to wander through the exhibit. And we do have a lecture. The Roger Revelle commemorative lecture starts at 5:30. So we have an hour between now and 5:30.
Okay, so feel free to grab a drink or whatever and come up to the upstairs gallery. We'll answer questions up there. And then I'll also be glad to show other parts of the building and exhibits if you're interested. Am I cutting you off?
As before you leave, I have a poem to share and Marcia has a second poem to share. And then what we will do is we are going to walk out, and as we go up the stairs, we'll stand on the stairs for a photo as we make our way up to the exhibit. So this is a courtesy of Tony McDonald, whose wonderful niece just happened to send this poem. So it was serendipitous. It's called The Gist of It by Zhang Lin. Some things are big from the beginning, such as oceans. Some things are small until the end, such as grass. Still, a few other things are already old even before we know them, like this old family home. I, myself, am gradually passing from small to big through the process of aging and ailing. All my life, I am a sprig of grass, thinking of the ocean as if returning home. Marcia?
Well, I do not have a deep poem to share, but I do have a limerick. There once was a fish in the sea who was worried about what is to be. He contacted Sue, asked, "What could you do to study the future of me?"
And as chair of the Ocean Studies Board, I do declare that we are done. Congratulations to all.